Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. After a long morning working in the fields and selling all the sweet potatoes at the market, Tu Diem returns home to discover that Toan has quietly finished building the stone table he worked on all day under the burning sun. What seems like an ordinary afternoon suddenly becomes a moment that makes both of them realize they no longer want to face their hard work alone. Now let's explore the story of Toan and Tu Diem together. Will their decision to start working side by side from tomorrow change their lives in unexpected ways? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. After a long day filled with worry, the small house of Toan and Tu Diem finally became quiet again as night settled in. The elderly woman they brought home had a place to rest, a warm meal and a roof to stay under for the night. No one said very much, but both of them understood that the unexpected reunion would remain in their memories for a long time. The elderly woman ate very slowly, each small spoon of rice as if she was remembering something far away. Tu Diem placed another bowl of hot soup in front of her. Toan sat across from her, occasionally glancing over to make sure she was still all right. There was no long conversation, but the atmosphere inside the small house felt naturally warm. That night passed quietly. Outside in the yard, the sound of insects continued steadily in the darkness. The small lamp inside the house was turned off a little later than usual. Then the next morning arrived gently like every other day. The first rays of sunlight slipped through the thick green leaves and fell across the long rows of sweet potato vines in the fields behind the village. The morning air was still cool and carried the familiar smell of damp soil. Tu Diem bent low over the familiar field, holding a small knife and cutting through the sweet potato vines with clean and steady motions. The faint sound of the blade touching the stems could be heard in the quiet of the early morning. Each time she pulled the vines aside, the soil beneath revealed golden sweet potatoes hidden under the ground. She gently brushed away the dirt and lifted them out one by one. Sweat slowly appeared on her forehead, even though the sun had not yet risen high, but her eyes brightened each time a good potato appeared. She picked one up, wiped away the dirt, and took a small bite. The gentle sweetness spread across her tongue, and she quietly said that today's potatoes were really sweet. The smaller potatoes still hidden in the soil made her let out a light breath. But she knew that this type of potato was good for the stomach and rich in fiber. And when boiled or steamed, simply its sweetness would become even clearer. In the village, many people like to eat boiled sweet potatoes for breakfast instead of rice. She continued working slowly and steadily. Each time she turned the soil and picked up another potato, it felt as if she was adding another small piece to the life that she and Toan were building together. The sun slowly climbed higher, and its light spread across the wide field, while her shadow stretched long across the rows of vines. Even though she was alone in the field, her heart was still full of hope. Every potato she harvested felt like another small step, bringing them closer to the dream they shared. She raised her hand to wipe the sweat from her forehead and looked toward the small house in the distance where Toan was working. The distance was not very far, but from the field she could only see the small roof and part of the yard in front. A quiet feeling of missing him appeared in her chest. Working in the field was quite tiring, and the silence of the wide land sometimes made her feel lonely, but today she felt stronger than usual. Working by herself and harvesting the crop with her own hands gave her a clear sense of confidence. After a while, the pile of sweet potatoes in the field had grown larger. She gathered them into bundles and placed them into the bamboo basket she had brought with her. When the basket was nearly full, she tied it carefully with a rope and lifted it onto her shoulder. The red dirt road leading to the market was still slightly wet from the morning dew. Every step she took along that road carried not only the sweet potatoes she had just harvested, but also the belief that each passing day was quietly building the future that the two of them were creating together. Under the strong midday sun, Toan stood in the dry yard in front of the house. In his hand was a construction trowel, and he was mixing cement mortar with movements that were familiar but already tiring. His shirt was soaked with sweat, and drops of sweat kept falling onto the dry ground. From time to time, he looked toward the road leading to the market, the same road Tu Diem had taken early that morning. A quiet thought appeared in his mind that she was out there alone and that the work must certainly not be easy. He tightened his grip on the handle of the hoe and continued working. In his mind, memories briefly appeared of construction sites far away from home, of the days when he had to work in many different places, the noise of machines, the trucks carrying building materials, and the tired evenings in small rented rooms. Then he remembered the decision to stop that life and stay here with Tu Diem to begin a more stable life together. He placed the first stone onto the ground and then placed the second one beside it. Each stone was placed very carefully and aligned straight. The steady rhythm of his work felt like the steady beat of a heart trying to stay calm. In his mind, many plans appeared. Buying a few animals, planting more crops, turning this small piece of land into a place that truly felt like a home. Thinking about that made him smile slightly, even though sweat and dust still covered his face. But then he looked at his phone again and checked the time once more. The call from Tu Diem had still not come. The phone remained silent. He continued pouring concrete into the mold and adjusting the edges of the stone table he was building. In his mind, there was one very clear thought. He wanted to create a cool place where she could sit and rest after long days of work, a place where the two of them could sit together and drink water in the afternoon. The sun continued to burn down strongly, but inside him there was another warm feeling. It was the feeling of working hard for someone he loved. He wiped his face, took a deep breath, and bent down again to continue working. Every stone he placed felt like another small step that tied their lives more closely together beneath the burning sky. The morning market slowly became lively with many voices. Buyers negotiated prices while sellers called out to customers, and the smell of fresh vegetables filled the air. Tu Diem spread a small mat on the ground and arranged the golden sweet potatoes into neat piles. When an elderly woman stopped and asked the price, she clearly said that the potatoes were 10,000 per kilogram. The woman picked up one potato to look at it and then nodded before buying 2 kilograms. Tu Diem smiled, chose the largest potatoes, and placed them into the bag for her. She explained that the potatoes had just been harvested from the field that morning, and that if they were left to dry a little longer, they would taste even sweeter. Another customer, a young woman, also stopped to ask about the price. After a short conversation, the young woman bought several kilograms. The atmosphere around Tu Diem's small stall became friendlier. Some people mentioned that sweet potatoes used to be much more expensive in the past, but now they were quite cheap. Those short conversations made the morning market feel warmer. Tu Diem kept smiling and thanking each person who bought from her. Watching the pile of potatoes on the mat slowly become smaller made her feel relieved. Every sale felt like a sign that the effort she had made that morning truly meant something. The sun climbed higher and the temperature rose quickly. Sweat ran down both sides of her cheeks, but she kept her voice gentle while speaking to customers. When a young girl bought the very last of the potatoes, Tu Diem let out a long breath. All the potatoes were sold. She quickly folded the mat, packed up her small belongings, and said goodbye to the familiar vendors nearby. Inside her heart, there was a simple but very clear happiness. The road back home now no longer felt long. It led her back to Toan, to a moment of rest after a busy morning of work, and to the chance to tell him the small stories that had happened at the market. The afternoon passed slowly along the red dirt road leading from the market back to the village. The sun stood close to overhead, causing the red dust on the road to dry and release a gentle heat. Tu Diem walked steadily, and the bamboo basket on her shoulder was now empty, much lighter than it had been in the morning. She could clearly feel each breeze passing across the shoulders of her shirt, which was damp with sweat after a long morning. Her body felt a little tired, yet her heart felt lighter. All the sweet potatoes she had brought to the market today were sold. For her, that was not only a few small bundles of money, but also proof that her hard work in the field that morning had not been wasted. Thinking about that made her steps feel more relaxed. The road leading back to the village had been familiar to her for many years. On both sides of the path were small fields and scattered clusters of bamboo. A few birds flew across the fields before landing on bamboo stakes placed beside the crops. From time to time, Tu Diem passed a few familiar villagers walking by. They greeted each other briefly and continued their own work. The noon atmosphere felt much quieter than the busy morning market. The sound of wind brushing across the fields and the faint buzzing of insects in the grass made the road feel even more peaceful. After walking a little farther, she stopped beneath the shade of a large tree beside the road to rest for a moment. The bamboo basket was placed gently on the ground. She lifted her hand to wipe the sweat from her forehead and looked toward the road that led back to the village. From here, it was not very far anymore. Thinking about returning home made her feel lighter inside. In her mind, she pictured Toan working in the yard. He was probably still building the stone table he had started earlier that morning. The thought made her smile quietly to herself. After resting for a few minutes, she lifted the basket onto her shoulder again and continued walking. When she passed the final bend in the road, she could already see the familiar roof of her house in the distance. That sight made her walk a little faster, as if her body naturally wanted to return to that familiar place after a long morning. On the other side of the village, Toan was still standing in the yard under the strong midday sun. The stone table and 4 stone chairs were almost finished. He held a trowel in his hand and carefully smoothed the layer of cement on the surface of the table. Sweat ran down along his cheeks and soaked into the collar of his shirt. Occasionally, he paused for a few seconds, straightened his back, and looked toward the road leading out to the fields. That was the same road Tu Diem had taken early in the morning when she carried the sweet potatoes to the market. He did not say it out loud, but inside he still felt a small worry. The sun today was quite strong. Working in the field and then carrying potatoes to the market to sell could not have been easy. He glanced at the phone resting near the doorway and then looked at the time. It was already early afternoon, yet he still had not seen her return. Even so, he knew that market days sometimes lasted longer than expected. He took a deep breath and continued working. Toan bent down to check the leg of the final stone chair. He pushed it lightly with his hand to see if it would move. The chair stood firmly on the ground. Then he stepped back a few steps to look at the entire table and the 4 chairs he had just completed. The simple stone blocks stood in the middle of the yard, but to him they carried a clear meaning. This would be the place where the 2 of them could sit and rest after long days of work. He sat down on one of the chairs to test it again. The chair did not move at all. He nodded slightly as if confirming that the work had been done well. At that moment, the sound of familiar footsteps came from the road in front of the house. Toan lifted his head. Tu Diem was walking through the gate. The bamboo basket on her shoulder was empty. Her shirt was damp with sweat, but there was a small smile on her face. "I'm back," she said simply. Toan immediately stood up and walked quickly toward the gate. His eyes brightened when he saw her. "I called you, but you didn't answer," he said. "The market was too crowded, so I didn't hear it," Tu Diem replied, and took 2 bottles of cold lemon tea from her bag. "I bought these for us." The two of them sat down on the newly made stone bench. Tu Diem handed 1 bottle to Toan. They opened the caps and drank slowly. The light sour taste of the lemon tea made their bodies feel cooler after standing under the sun. A gentle breeze moved across the yard, carrying the smell of soil and dry grass from the fields behind the house. Toan told her about the stone table and the 4 chairs he had just completed. He pointed to different parts and explained how he placed the stones and mixed the cement so the table would remain strong. Tu Diem listened and gently touched the surface of the stone table. The table was still slightly warm from the afternoon sunlight. "It looks beautiful," she said. Toan looked at her and asked, "How was the market today?" "It was good. All the potatoes were sold," she replied. Hearing that, Toan let out a quiet breath of relief. The two of them sat silently for a moment, listening only to the wind moving through the garden and the soft rustling of leaves. After a while, Tu Diem looked around the yard and said that starting tomorrow she would not go to the field alone anymore. She wanted to work together with Toan at home. If sweet potatoes needed to be harvested, the two of them would go together. Toan looked at her for a few seconds. There was a warm feeling in his eyes. "I was thinking the same thing," he said. The afternoon slowly became gentler. The sunlight was no longer as harsh as it had been at noon. The two of them stood up and adjusted the stone table once more. They placed a few small stones beneath the legs of the chairs to keep them balanced on the ground. After finishing, they sat down again to test everything once more. The table and the 4 chairs stood firmly in the yard. A gentle breeze blew through the yard, carrying the smell of soil and dry grass from the fields behind the house. The two of them sat side by side and finished the rest of the lemon tea. Neither of them spoke very much, yet both of them could feel the peacefulness of that afternoon. The sunlight of the day slowly leaned toward the western sky. The shadows of the stone table and the chairs stretched long across the ground. In the distance beyond the fields, the sound of wind moving through the rows of sweet potatoes could be heard softly. In that small yard, Toan and Tu Diem remained sitting quietly beside each other for a while longer. A long day had passed, but for them the simple peace of that moment was exactly what made all the hard work worthwhile. After a short while, Tu Diem stood up and walked into the kitchen to begin preparing dinner. Toan remained outside in the yard for a few minutes more, looking once again at the stone table he had just finished building. As the light of the afternoon slowly faded, he walked inside the house as well. A new day was coming to an end, yet inside both of them there was a quiet sense of comfort, because they knew that tomorrow they would continue working together again on the familiar land that had slowly become their home.
Sau một buổi sáng vất vả ngoài ruộng, Tử Diễm mang khoai ra chợ bán và may mắn bán hết toàn bộ số khoai trong ngày. Trên con đường đất đỏ trở về làng, cô cảm thấy nhẹ nhõm dù cơ thể đã mệt sau nhiều giờ làm việc. Trong khi đó, ở nhà, Toan vẫn kiên trì hoàn thành chiếc bàn đá và 4 chiếc ghế ngoài sân dưới cái nắng gay gắt của buổi trưa. Khi Tử Diễm trở về, hai người cùng ngồi nghỉ trên chiếc bàn đá mới xây, uống trà chanh và chia sẻ với nhau về một ngày làm việc. Khoảnh khắc bình yên đó khiến cả hai nhận ra họ không muốn tiếp tục làm việc riêng lẻ nữa. Từ ngày mai, họ quyết định cùng nhau làm việc trên mảnh đất quen thuộc, bắt đầu một nhịp sống mới, gắn bó và đồng hành hơn.